Welcome to the Biennale Sessions, a series of talks and panels to expand and extend the topics presented at London Design Biennale 2021. In this session, we will be joined by two members of the design team that created the Israel Pavilion. Today's session is called Amplifying Echoes, Dynamics and Contradictions of the Hyper-Connected World. The digital trends of the last decade, social networks and the pandemic have all contributed to the multiplication of digital platforms for social interaction, which have created opportunities for debate and for sharing of information. But at the same time, hyperconnectivity appears to be amplifying an interesting process of polarization. In this session, we're going to be looking at the dynamics and paradoxes of the digital world and how they translate into the physical world. So let me first introduce today's speakers. Lior Kantor is currently completing her architecture degree at Azrieli School of Architecture at Tel Aviv University. Her research is focused on the influence of food supply chains and habits on urban and peri-urban relationships on a national scale. Roi Levin has led the research for this project. Roi is an architect, a graduate of the Azrieli School of Architecture at Tel Aviv University, and is currently working an HQ Architects in Tel Aviv. So we're going to first start with a presentation. Welcome, Roi and Lior.
Hello.
Thank you for the intro, John. Hi, John. Thank you for the intro.
We've got an open border allowing this stuff to come in freely.
It's not about Ukrainians who are allowed to come to Poland. It's about illegal migrants who wants to cross our borders. And if you're brown, white, yellow, or whatever, if you want to cross our border illegally, you're not allowed.
Canada is a country that was built by immigration.
We will begin working on an impenetrable, physical, tall, powerful, beautiful southern border wall.
Again, thank you for the introduction, John. I'm Roi, and our project is called the Boiler Room. Yes, this year's theme for the Biennale was resonance, and our project addresses that theme through the observation that the world has gone through two contradicting yet overlapping processes, which are globalization and networking and nationalism. Which amplify nationalism, internet, social media, etc. And we feel that this tension that's been amplified is leading the world to a boiling point. The Boiler Room, our installation, seeks to render this tension by creating a space for self-exploration that allows you to do two basic functions. One is to hear and the other to feel, to touch. Going through the tunnel, we hear opposing echoes from two sides of the tunnel. One of the nationalistic wall on the right, and on the left, the globalist wall.
So, we're going to build it. Who's going to pay for the wall? 100%. By the way, 100%.
I call on all countries that seek peace to join the United States
Brussels
in recognizing
wants to inundate us.
Thank you for that. That was a quick example. Coming out of the tunnel, we face multiple choices. 2,500 switches with hashtags on them, each with a specific naming, each with a different hashtag, taking very complex notions and turning them into a mere single word or hashtag. Visitors are encouraged to come and engage and press on their relevant topics and express their opinions through those multiple options, and basically take part in a global discussion with the mere act of pressing a switch or swiping a button. I think one of the main focuses we had in our research is of the concept of reduction of complex issues into facile slogans, such as hashtags. I think this process is what allows complex notions to be much more accessible, and basically has a crucial role in the process of amplification and polarization in our society today. For example, if you take the global warming hashtag, I think it's a complex issue that eventually people just press on and make an opinion. It's easy as that. The decision to choose the boiler switch, which is a common staple product in the Israeli household, was sort of like a representation of what a daily routine procedure, like pressing a button and doing that on a very daily like operation, could come with such ease, but eventually has immense consequences, such as double tapping an Instagram post or liking something on Facebook. From inside to out, our visitors are taking through an experience beginning with a sensory battlefield and ending with an action.
I'm going to jump in here and discuss how we actually divided those topics and how we wanted to translate them into more physical and tactile experiences. So we looked at 18 different topics. Each one of them, we had 2 different groups we associated with either globalization or nationalism. And the different topics are kind of assorted in a way that allows people to not exactly notice the difference between them. I mean, it's not marked as a grid or something, but you can actually look at it, you can find yourself along all these ideas. And if you move on to the next slide, we can see that the 2 walls are mirror images of one another. So the idea is that when you press those hashtags, those buttons, and you turn on a sound, because that's what they do, if I haven't mentioned that earlier. So when you walk inside the tunnel, you're surrounded with these different sounds that come to you from different directions, from opposing ends. And when you hear the same topic being discussed from 2 different angles, from 2 different perspectives, coming from your left and from your right, you kind of feel overwhelmed and flooded and sort of even, I would say, anxious, because it's this dark tunnel that surrounds you with the different sounds, and you're not quite sure who you agree with, what you think, and why is everything so out there. So this is actually the first image that we're seeing from the actual exhibition, which opened a week ago. And one of the most amazing things was how aesthetically pleasing this all became. And especially since it's so dynamic and it changes all the time with people pressing it and people taking pictures of it. But when we discussed how we want the experience to be, when we designed the curation, the experience of it, we defined 3 different types of visitors that enter the room. So the first ones would be the more, if we could move on, would be the more playful visitors. So you can see children playing around with the buttons. You can see people drawing hearts, which was a lovely surprise that we saw every day almost, and other shapes and write things. And this is one thing that we don't want to neglect with all these intellectual discussions and the beautiful pavilions around the exhibition. It was really important for us to kind of invite everyone to take part and let everyone participate in this installation. So the playfulness of this was important. The next one would be the more content aware visitors. So these would be people who would actually look at each one of the hashtags and would feel passionate or empathetic about something. And they would walk around quietly, look around the room, press things on, turn things on, off, and kind of engage with the actual ideas that are brought forward across this room. And the last visitor would be the immersive one, which will kind of take in the entire experience. They will begin in the tunnel. As you can see, the 4 speakers that kind of surround you with a sound, and the gradient red wall that signifies the boiling up, the heating up of this process. And when you emerge from this tunnel, you see all those switches, you're surrounded by them, you press them, you turn on the sounds for the people inside. You can relate to ideas, you can object ideas, and that's the beauty and the immersiveness of this whole idea. So this is how it actually looks. This is how the boiler switches actually look, and they're organized in a way that it should feel very approachable for you to press it on. But one thing that we noticed that was really interesting to see is that probably due to COVID and due to the fact that it's an arts exhibition, people aren't sure. We saw that people are a bit reluctant to touch the switches in the beginning, but then there was this beautiful process of people kind of coming in, seeing something, not sure if to touch or not, but then seeing something that they really relate to or opposed to, and they kind of naughtily, they kind of switch it on or off. And then it's addictive. So you see something else and you press it on and you press it off. And we see people that spend 10 minutes, 15 minutes in the room just playing with ideas, saying what they think. I've also seen someone turn something on and then this other person standing behind, just waiting for them to finish to come and turn it off. So this debate, this discussion, the people engaging with one another, even though it's super anonymously and it's super quietly and it's super, friendly, I want to say, there's something, in our opinion, that translates the digital experience and the ease of it, the ease of, as Roi said, double clicking on Instagram or liking on Facebook, and just translating it into something so sensory, so tactile, so straightforward, that this is what we wanted people to come out with. And the effect that it has on the people walking inside without even noticing. So yeah, so that's the group of designers. We're all architects and students and graduates from the David Azrieli School of Architecture at Tel Aviv University. And these are our sponsors: the Tel Aviv University, the embassy, Nisco, which is a company that makes these switches, and a lot of other people who have helped us make this thing happen.
Thank you both, Roi and Lior, for this explanation of what went into the creation of the boiler room. Now, Lior, you just mentioned a bit about it, but I want to dig a bit deeper. So what do you hope that visitors get out of this experience inside the boiler room?
Okay, so first of all, I want to point out that all the hashtags that we've collected, and I've been asked about that from visitors, they're all things that we took out of popular databases. So it's not things that we are saying, it's not our political opinions or social opinions. And the idea is that we're observers. We're looking at processes that are happening, and we're warning, but not in a catastrophic way, just in a way, guys, look around, look what's happening. We wanted the internet to be something that connects us together, but at the end, it's kind of bringing us further away from one another. And COVID is a great example of that, because on the one hand, the entire world was in the same boat, I want to say. We've all experienced the same things together. But on the other hand, it took us back decades with how borders were closed and how, we have all these things going on in the world. We have Brexit, we have MAGA, we have all these groups that kind of call out to close back nations. And we think that social media and the fact that it reduces such complex ideas into something so easy to sweep thousands and tens of thousands of people without actually noticing what's happening. So we wanted to, one thing is to represent this tension and kind of warn about it. And the other hand was to show us the effects of the things, of the ease of the things we do, and how oblivious we are sometimes to the consequences that they have.
Yeah, and I think one thing we've been seeing during the last 18 months also is that it's very easy to forget what was going on and only focus on what's happening in the present moment. Because, for example, if you think about global warming, and there are several of the switches that relate to this, until a year and a half ago or two in London, there was this big move to, for example, have people reuse cups, bring their own cup, to order their coffee and get rid of the disposable cutlery and stuff like that. But during the pandemic, because of the fear of spreading it, we actually stopped reusing cups and cutlery and stuff. So it's almost like the decades that they've been into addressing an issue were wiped away by the present issue, which is not a light one. Of course, it's been very, very serious, but it feels almost like when the peak of the pandemic or the effect of the pandemic will be over, or at least lower, we'll have to start from scratch again with some of those things.
Absolutely.
Now, I love the metaphor of the boiler room switch, not just because it's a household item, in Israel, but also because it clearly identifies, the polarization we see these days with something being off or on, 0 or 1, black and white, almost ignoring all the grays that are in between anything and everything. There's no topic which is 100% or 0%. So I wonder, do you both think that these move to polarization, ignoring everything that happens in the middle between 0 and a 1, do you think it was inevitable due to the platforms we created or the tools we created, or how, as individuals we see the world?
And in my opinion, I think the process we're going through is not a generational process. It's not something that's very specific to today. I think it's something that humanity's been going through for generations, and I think this is sort of like a cycle. I think what differentiates this cycle from previous cycles is the fact that this sort of platform actually amplifies to an extreme these voices, but not the moderate voices. I think it amplifies mainly the extreme voices. And what we get is a sort of like an image of the two most extreme polarized ends. And eventually the moderates, they're sort of shut down and nobody hears their voice. And I think that's what creates sort of like an image, I think a false image, if I may say so, of a reality that is so dichotomic or binary. I don't think it's binary at all. I think we have the full spectrum. I just don't think it has the stage to appear.
That's interesting. And actually, I was thinking while you were speaking that you built a physical space at the London Design Biennale to make visible something that's happening or it's being amplified in the digital space or in a digital place. So what do you think gets lost in digital that requires, you, but in general, a society, for us to create physical spaces to talk about these things or visualize these things? Or to make it simpler, what is lost in digital that requires the constant anchoring to physical?
If I may make a slight detour from what you ask, but I think that actually corresponds to what you're saying. I think, in my opinion, what we're seeing right now, and I think that's what we tried to show, is the effect, like the echo chamber effect. Basically, I think what this installation shows is having a full and a broad picture of seeing both sides and not getting your own side echo chamber and echo around you again and again. Because what we have, let's say I use Facebook on a daily basis, I get the same kind of input on my wall from everyone who thinks the same as I do. And someone from the opposing side would probably get the same. And he gets this false image of reality that this is his complete reality, and eventually he should win the next election if he had if his Facebook image was the correct one. But eventually what happens is that I think the internet gives a very false, especially social media, gives a very false impression of that. And I think in terms of what you asked, I think the physical installation that we made tries to show that exactly, because I think going through this tunnel gives you, and having the ability to affect both sides, the right wall and the left wall, even though they don't necessarily voice your opinion, or I think that the ability to see them both happening simultaneously gives some kind of realization to the user that this is the process we're going through, and this is what it looks like all around. And I think that's what sort of like separates the digital platform from the physical platform.
I think that's also one of the reasons, I'm just jumping in here, one of the reasons that we wanted the outer part with the switches to be so red and light and playing with it, while the inside was completely dark, because we wanted to create the same kind of dichotomy between the two, and this state of anxiety and moving on to a state of complete control. So this is also kind of representing the tension between the digital and the physical worlds.
Right. And in fact, it's very, the the installation is very immersive, not just because you walk into it, but because you can feel that you're having an effect, even though you're not aware of it. You mentioned this earlier, Lior. People, by touching the buttons and turning on or off topics, it's changing how it's reacting, the sounds you're getting inside, which is sometimes, again, I think it's a great metaphor of reality. Sometimes we are living through the consequences of decisions that someone else made, even though we are not aware of it. So maybe you might not be aware that you're changing the sounds, but the next person visiting is going to be experiencing what someone else before them decided, which I think also represents very much what we are going through.
Absolutely.
Now, I mean, this is, of course, a matter of opinion, but let's say we could go back 20 years into the past when many of these platforms, digital platforms, were being created. Often they were coming from either a very specific part of the world or being built by people with very specific competences, often technical. Now, do you think that by involving different professions, different skills, or different voices, when these platforms were created, they would have had a different effect on the world? Or was this polarization, and kind of one-sidedness of reinforcing each one's echo chamber inevitable? Because earlier, Roi, you were mentioning that this is part of a human cycle, right? These things of globalizing and then going back to nationalism stuff has been happening, throughout human history. So do you think something was missing 20 years ago that tweaking that a bit would have led to a better place, or eventually this was inevitable?
If I can answer shortly, I'd say no. I think the process is inevitable. In my opinion, I'm the pessimist. But I do think that the extent to which we can control it, or I don't want to say tame, maybe, is something we could have done differently and maybe in a better way. And I think this is a very hot discussion right now, and I've heard a lot of YouTubers and a lot of media people that talk about this topic and how at this stage we can enforce it. And I think what we've seen today with Trump being shut out of Instagram and Twitter, and say for other, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was actually, his son was shut out of Twitter. So I think we've seen these kind of late reactions, and these late reactions are sort of like a late understanding that what we're talking about, or the danger of what we're talking about, the danger of misinformation and the danger of polarization social media has on reality. So I think, if you look backwards, then maybe we could have addressed it differently. I don't think the end result would have been different in the broad sense, but maybe in the way or the extent to which it came to. So yes.
Yeah. One of the big questions we're asking at London Design Biennale this year is, can we design a better world? Because often we forget that almost everything has been designed, either directly or indirectly. Some things are designed by nature, and there are consequences of processes, but they're not just spontaneous out of magic. But other things we built ourselves, right? We built these platforms, we built one of the other installations, the German one, addresses plastic cutlery, right? Which it seemed a great idea decades ago, and they're about to be banned in Europe. So probably in a few decades, it's going to be seen as ridiculous, right? So, but we created those things, often with good intentions or with purely economic intentions. So if we, not just as designers, but as people that create this world and shape this world, can have an effect, what do you think, or what would you like to leave people with, with your participation at the Biennale? How do you want them to reflect on their own actions?
I think our installation invites people to feel free to interact with other people, and we invite people to express their opinions. And we also invite them to think twice before they do that, just as they think twice before they press a switch because they're afraid of COVID, or they don't know if they should. We invite people to kind of think, and also think about how reduced all of these ideas are, because when you see everything together and you see that that the most complex and most fired up conversations in the world can be reduced into a word or two words or a phrase, then it means that something isn't clear, isn't understood. So we want to, the fact that we want to take them through this experience of tension, of anxiety, of everything colliding, and then letting them choose, means that we want them to be aware of the consequences and the possibility of how quickly this debate can heat up, and yeah, thinking twice.
Yeah, there's a design mantra, a famous design mantra that says, make it simple, not simpler, right? And it feels like we reduce so many things to the 0 or 1, the binary choice, because we thought we were making things simpler and better, but actually we made issues more complex, almost going again the idea of making the world more understandable. Again, the other thing that you were showing earlier, Lior, that how sections of the installation are dedicated to different topics. But when you see them all together, it's also quite powerful because you see all these things happening at the same time. And maybe I'm only interested in this topic or this other topic, but you cannot abstract yourself from the world. All these other things are happening, even if you're not interested in them. There's someone else who might come and feel stronger about one of those. So I like this view. And even if the switches are binary, they show you that all these topics are present at the same time. You can reduce as much as you want, but the world is still there. It doesn't disappear.
Absolutely.
I wonder, this is if you want, is geeking about the design and the building of this installation per se, but what was the biggest challenge of bringing this physical space to life?
Oh, wow. That's a good question. We've had a lot of challenges, beginning with pandemic, a war.
Global pandemic, yes, of course.
A war, election, like 4 elections in our country over the past 2 years since we started this designing the electronic system. Or can tell you how complex that was. When we arrived in London and the shipping hasn't arrived on time, that was complex as well. We have so many more, but I think we'll just leave it to the fact that it's up and running and you're invited to come and see it.
Yes, yeah, and people often forget what goes into building these things, right? I remember seeing the electrician working all the cables and stuff, and I thought, oh, I'm happy I don't have to do that, because it's how many switches again do you have in the installation?
2,500.
2,500, yeah, right. So only one of those short circuiting would be a nightmare. Yeah. Knocking on wood.
Yeah. Now, and it was all built and designed by the design team, who are architects and have learned a lot of different
professions on the way.
Yeah, professions on the way.
Right. As an engineer, I can relate. That you need everybody at the same level, because the design can be beautiful, but if then an electrician or someone doing the installation, they are not at the same position or same role, the whole thing doesn't work, which I think is also a reflection of the world we're living in, right? So you need all these different competences and skills and awareness and empathy at the same time. There's not just one side that can guide everything, because again, if you're responsible in your life and domain for, let's say, one of the switches, there's all the other switches around, and all these topics around, which one thing affects the other one.
Absolutely. I think interconnectivity is a main theme. I think it's something that we sometimes disregard too often. And I think it makes things simpler. And we like things simple. And that's the reason why we reduce complex notions into that. I think it's a sort of like, it's the same cycle. But yeah, I think that's basically why these ideas are so accessible, because they're simple. Simple is easy, and sometimes simple misleads and misinforms, and we don't get a broad picture. Reality is much more complex, much more interconnected, and it's much less one-sided. So I think if we have a message about this installation or about what we wanted to say about this whole process, I think it's that.
Yeah, and I think also it reflects on empathy, right? Because sometimes lack of empathy with what's happening around our lives, institutions and organizations, is because of lack of awareness of other things and other realities. And again, it's very easy, especially on digital platforms, as you were mentioning earlier, to fall into an echo chamber, which makes everything else invisible. So it's interesting to see that some digital platforms these days, when you're about to reshare something, they recently added a question that says, have you read the article? Instead of just clicking and stuff, which I understand the intention, but sometimes it sounds a bit patronizing, because maybe I wrote the article, or maybe I read it on another platform, and I want to share it because I'm already aware of it, but the platform doesn't know who you are, what's your life beyond the behaviors you had on it. I mean, they can have lots of data on your behaviors and infer lots of things, but still is a very partial image of a human being and a human life, and what context you're in. Now, I wonder if you could push this installation even further. If this were, in the center of a city, or in a place accessible to millions of people, what do you think could be done with all the information or all the reactions that you can see manifested into this installation? Do you think it could be input for making better decisions, or for trying to improve the world we're living in? As I said, one of our big questions is at the Biennale is, can we design a better world, or can design change habits? Can we design better systems? So do you think that your installation could be used to maybe lead us into a better place?
I hope so.
Yeah, we hope so. We definitely hope so. I would like to say one thing about the difference between the way we make choices on the internet and the way you make a choice that is shown to everyone near the installation. Because basically, when you come to outdoors or indoors, you come to a public space and you press something in an installation, everybody sees the choice you made. And I think that makes a difference. The same for when you go to they put your ballot in the general elections. Nobody knows what you voted. But here, I think it's a different process. So I think that the main thing that I think people should be aware of is the broad effect of pressing a switch, and understanding that there's two sides to that coin. And yeah, I think that's the main effect. I don't think it should have any other teaching effect beyond that.
So the topic, you mentioned this earlier too, the topic of the theme of this year's Biennale is resonance, right? And how everything has a ripple effect onto something else. And as I said, I believe that your pavilion makes an important part of resonance visible, right? Because you see the consequences, or someone can experience the consequences of someone else's actions. What led you to choose, you mentioned, the boiler switches are part of everyday life, and people are used to it and they give it for granted. But how did you get to the conclusion that you could manifest resonance with all these switches and all the topics? Tell me a bit more into the design process that went originally into the pavilion, or if you were discussing other ideas and this ended up being the best one to represent what you wanted to show.
The beginning, when we started, we looked at resonance actually in the context of globalization and nationalism, and we looked at different processes that have been happening around the world, and how at times they overlap and at times they contradict. And that was the initial outlook on resonance. And then as things progressed, and as we deemed social media as something that is responsible for this process of polarization, we kind of looked at how we think all of these things combine together, and how this social media has an effect on this tension between globalization and nationalism. And this is what led us to think about resonance in a more physical, tactile kind of way. And the boiler switches, it's a design item that's very unique to Israel. So we saw Israelis just walking into the exhibition saying, this is the boiler switch, because in many places around the world, I don't know, in England, you don't necessarily have to press a specific button to heat up the water. And for us, it's something that's just so, it's funny to think about how simplistic it is to turn on a button to turn up the heat. So it was just something that kind of, it's a simple press, it's a simple act that resonates a much more complex understanding of something that we do.
Yeah, I'm curious how many people will go back home and find their boiler switches and stuff and see them in a completely different way, because you've made something which is almost invisible. You know, when something you give for granted, it disappears, which also reflects a bit what's happening online, right? We give certain things for granted, so we never think of the consequence of our actions. So I wonder how many people will go back home and before pressing the boiler switch, think, okay, what if this was about gender equality or globalization or global warming and stuff? So you brought, you know, all this consciousness, and you say, oh, okay, I'm not going to take a shower. I feel it's too much, you know, to press, you know, it's this button now. But as I said, I mean, I'm not allowed to have preferences with which is my favorite pavilion and stuff, because I'm one of the organizers. But I do like very much the effect it has, both you know, conscious and kind of intellectual, if you wish, but also how it vibrates and resonates. Because even if you do nothing, if you just walk into the room and watch people, how they behave, how they interact, how they look, even their expressions. I was paying attention to people sometimes reading one of the topics and maybe frowning or maybe smiling and then pressing, and you could see those that would press, you know, very quickly because they, you know, again, they don't know they're allowed to. Yeah. But others who spend almost like they're playing a piano, right? They spend lots of time there and want to almost, if as clicking the switches could actually have a direct change in the world, as if the world was connected, you know, to all these buttons. So that was lovely to see. So I thank you both and your whole team, which you showed earlier in a photo. I thank you also for enduring through all the challenges of, you know, bringing this to London through a global pandemic, but also because I think that you're making visible something which often is invisible. So thank you both very much for that.
Thank you very much, Jan.
Thank you for having us.